Hello, Ayul here, back with another video, the second in 2 days. This is going to be the next video in my series of support raid tips, but unlike the other videos, I'm going to be talking more generally about support gameplay rather than focusing on these kind of tricks or cheese tactics. The goal of these videos has always been to help you guys maximize your impact as a support in these raids, but at this point, if you really want to do that, the best way is to fully understand the raid mechanics and predicting where problems might occur. If you can do that, you'll be able to either warn your raid and prevent accidents, or use your abilities to prevent these problems from wiping the raid. Let's get right into it.
상스러운 가오가 항상 당신과 함께하길.
알 거야. 벨은 시끌벅적하던데 우리도 한번 가볼까?
모처럼 꽤 흥분했는걸?
이제 몽환이 아크라시아를 뒤덮을 것이다. 가라, 몽환의 권속들이여. 어디 놀아볼까?
열심히 하지 않으면
굴복하라, 현실의 눈먼자여.
내가 너를 구원해줄게.
주머니지도 모른다고.
Welcome to BRELSHAZA. If you've made it here, you've made it to what is the end game of current Lost Ark content in the West. Now again, I just want to reiterate that this video isn't meant to teach or show you guys all of the raid mechanics, or else it would be 8 hours long. Now if you haven't already, I'd highly recommend watching any of the awesome guides out there before coming back, or you can check out my full BRELSHAZA lecture on Twitch, and I'll leave a link to that in the description below. Let's start with Gate 1. In my opinion, supporting Gate 1 is all about survival and protection. The DPS check, especially after the nerfs, and considering most DPS mains are already over leveled, is really lenient. Even a group of 1490 alts would have more than enough time to meet the enraged timer. So as a support, being liberal with your shields and healing will give way more impact than holding for a DPS buff. And I know this mostly applies to bards. Paladins, just do your thing, turn your aura on. Let's talk about preparing for Gate 1. The items you're going to want are pots, whirlwind bombs, destruction bombs, and panaceas. You won't really need time stops because you're so tanky, and again, dark bombs are not required since DPS is not an issue. I'll talk a little bit about bard engravings, but paladin engravings are mostly the same. You're going to want awakening, your class engraving, and heavy armor as your core engravings. Obviously, as a paladin, you won't need heavy armor. I'd highly recommend adding expert and vital point hit on top of that. Expert is really powerful, especially on swiftness builds, for providing that shielding and healing that we want. Vital is an almost overpowered engraving in the entirety of BRELSHAZA because of how many stagger checks there are. If you don't have vital in your build yet, I'd highly recommend finding a way to slot it in, or grabbing an accessory or two and reading the legendary book for cheap so you can swap to it when needed. For spec builds, you can replace expert with spirit absorb, and for experienced players or the super confident, you can get rid of heavy armor for whatever you want, or even run heavy armor level 1. Now for our skill build, our core 6 skills are always going to be the same, which means we have 2 empty slots to play with. For Gate 1, we'll be bringing skills that fit the room we're assigned to, in order to make the first phase go more smoothly. Remember that you can swap your skills after zoning into the room, so make sure you check the room you're in and then swap your skills. If you're planning to do this, make sure you communicate with your party or raid members so they don't accidentally start the raid before you're ready. I'll be going over my recommendations for the skills in each room. Also, keep in mind, we don't actually have the official translations yet for the rooms, so some of the names might change on release. However, the mechanics will be the same, and I'll try to have a pinned comment with any changes to the translations. Most rooms will be taking buckshot for the counter mechanic later on at 45 bars, but in all situations you can always replace buckshot with Rhapsody or any other skill that you want if your raid can counter without you. Let's start with Party 1. So Party 1 can either be in the Sadness Room or the Despair Room. In the Sadness Room, you'll need to remove the shield on the dog with Destruction or Weak Point abilities. I'd recommend bringing Rhapsody and Buckshot for this room, just for the little bit of extra destruction. Rhapsody is also helpful throughout the other phases as well, so it's nice to be able to bring it for this room and the upcoming phases. In the Sadness Room, the statue will spawn a grape at certain points, and you'll be able to see this grape forming before it actually spawns and aggroes you. If the grape is eaten by anyone, the raid will take massive damage, and not just the people in your room, but all 4 rooms. Since you don't have to worry about DPS, as a support you should always position yourself near the statue to get aggro on the grape and kite it. Be careful not to stand too close to the grape when you're getting aggro or while kiting it, because you might eat it by accident. Once you have aggro, it will always follow you until it despawns, so you don't have to be super close to it. In addition, there are going to be random tiles that explode every 20 seconds or so. If you ever find yourself in a bad spot, you can use Rhapsody or any other super armor to prevent yourself from getting knocked down. This is also the reason you don't want to be super close to the grape while kiting it, because getting knocked down when it's close to you is a really common way that people eat this by mistake. Next, I'll talk about the Despair Room. So this is the other room you can find yourself in if you're in party number 1. In the Despair Room, the shield on the dog can be removed by killing 25 adds. The statue will periodically do a stagger check that, if you fail, will fear your entire raid. I'd recommend taking Soundholic and Buckshot. You can help your DPS kill the adds by CCing them with Sonic Vibration or with Prelude of Storm. It's okay to use Sonic Vibration just to lift the monsters up, even if it overlaps with Heavenly Tune here, because we don't really care about DPS, and the dog has a shield until you kill all the adds, so DPS doesn't really matter. Try to use your shield and Guardian Tune as much as possible, since the chip damage from the monsters can actually add up a lot. And also, because we don't care about DPS, you can just spam 1 bar heals as a bard here. The first phase can last quite a while depending on the raid's experience and how well the people in the other rooms are doing, so if you don't spend your meter, you might find yourself holding it for a little too long. Generally, I'll throw out 1 to 2 1 bar heals before holding my gauge for the next part of the fight. Most importantly, make sure you always hold your Soundholic for the statue stagger check. If you have Vital Point, you can basically solo stagger the statue with just Soundholic, but if you don't, then consider saving 1 or 2 extra skills like Sonic Vibration or throwing a Whirlwind Bomb. Of course, if your DPS player helps to stagger, then it's pretty easy, but sometimes they're busy with the adds or they get knocked down or they have no skills up, so it's nice as a support to be able to take care of it by yourself. Now let's go to Party 2. Party 2 can find themselves in 2 rooms, the Silence Room or the Rage Room. In the Silence Room, the shield on the dog can be removed by stagger. The statue itself has to be interrupted periodically or it will blind the entire raid. So I'd recommend taking Soundholic here and Buckshot. The blind debuff that the statue can do is extremely annoying and it makes everyone's life a lot harder, so the statue has to be interrupted at all costs. You'll know what I mean when you're trying to kite the grape in the Sadness Room, and because people in the Silence Room fail, you can't even see where it is. Because we have a built-in stun in our kit with Prelude of Storm, make sure you're saving that ability only to stun. You don't ever want to use it for meter and then have no stun available when the statue channels the blind ability. Even a full spec bard can interrupt every single cast, and paladins can also take the stun tripod on their light shock ability for the same effect. For paladins, I wouldn't recommend taking the electrocute tripod on Wrath of God, since you'd have to sacrifice your meter gain tripod. Keep in mind the blind is also not a CC effect, so it can't be immune by Bard's Guardian Tune. However, the debuff can be cleansed with Purify Rune, Panacea, Sacred Charms, and Paladin's Cleanse. Other than the statue, just focus on helping your DPS stagger the dog so that it can be killed quickly. The last room we'll talk about is the Rage Room for Party 2. In the Rage Room, the shield is removed after receiving a certain number of hits. The statue also applies a stacking debuff that increases damage taken. The debuff can be cleansed once by staggering the statue, so you don't want to stagger the statue right away and you don't want to hit it with a bunch of AoEs. I'd recommend taking Soundholic and Buckshot here. There's nothing much to do other than to hit the dog as much as possible with multi-hit abilities, and once you have a few stacks of the damage debuff, stagger the statue. Abilities like Sound Shock are obviously really good here because they hit so many times. That about covers the 4 rooms, so let's skip ahead now to the final phase where you fight the boss after it's fused together. As a support, you will want to try and step on the inactive tiles that will spawn around the arena, and the reason you want to do this is to try and pop them so they don't overlap too many at the same time. Also, inactive tiles that aren't dealt with, eventually they'll turn into a degen AoE tile that does a ton of damage whenever anyone steps on it. After 85 bars, after doing the tile safe zone mechanic, try to use your awakening because all of the inactive tiles at this point will automatically explode. This can do a ton of damage if you have too many tiles remaining because they will all overlap with each other. So the awakening is really good here, and if you don't, you can use any other kind of DR. For the 45 bar counter mechanic, you get a ton of cooldown reduction every time someone hits a successful counter. So don't just stand around and wait even if you have no counter. Try to spam all your abilities to get meter, and you can also use your heals here. This plus the shielding and damage reduction you can give will go a long way in helping your raid survive in case anyone misses any counters. Now let's move on to gate 2. For items, you're going to want pots, sleep bombs, whirlwind, or fire grenades. Your builds and engravings are basically going to be your standard build. For bards at this point, I'd probably drop buckshot and bring soundholic and rhapsody for every single gate until gate 6. Almost immediately after starting the fight, your Procol killer, aka the guy who's going inside, will go into his 1v1 room. If he's in your party, make sure you give him as many buffs as possible before the bar on the golden thread expires. Paladins can give their awakening shield and an attack buff, that is Heavenly Blessing or Wrath of God, while bards can give the 3-bar, attack buff, and Symphonia. If you didn't have at least 2 bars as a bard going into gate 2, you can consider drinking a stimulant before heading inside, but that can get expensive, especially if you're doing prog, so it is optional. The main thing that supports are going to worry about is the 135 bar mech. Remember that these HP bars are based off Procol's HP and not the skull boss that you fight outside. Although it's nice if your Procol killer communicates the HP to you, it's pretty hectic in there, especially if they're not experienced. So you should just prepare for these mechs even if you don't get a warning. When you see it happen, then you can react to it. You'll need to eat one of the 3 orange balls that spawns along with your other support and one other member that you decide on beforehand. Then you 3 will move together to each of the diamonds that spawn in order to erase them. The main tip I want to give here is to check where the diamonds are shooting as you are running there, and if you can't see it, be extra careful, because if you get hit by more than one of the diamond projectiles, you'll lose your buff and you'll have to wait around for the next orange orb to spawn. Generally you start at 6 o'clock, and for the first diamond at 6 o'clock, always try to run to the right of it as you head down, because it starts shooting from 6 o'clock and goes clockwise. The other thing we'll keep an eye on is the 80 bar mech. When the 4 orbs spawn, supports should prioritize getting rid of the stagger ball, especially if you have vital point hit. Bards are especially good here because you can shoot sound shock from range at the white ball, which is destroyed via a number of hits. I like to quickly check where the stagger ball is and where the white ball is, and then try to take care of both of them at the same time. At the very least, you can shoot one sound shock towards the white ball before heading to the stagger ball. Make sure that as soon as the mech starts, you also cast Heavenly Tune or Wrath of God or Heavenly Blessing so that the DPS dealing with the damage ball have an easier time killing it. Lastly, after the 45 bar mech, when you sit in the red safe zones, a Phantom Knight will spawn. You want to kill this as soon as possible because the Procol boss inside is invisible as long as the knight is alive, which makes it a lot more dangerous inside. Try to save your identity buff so that you can use it immediately after the knight spawns. Okay, gate 3. After this, you're halfway done BRELSHAZA, but not really. In terms of items for gate 3, we're going to want potions, time stops, whirlwind, and destruction bombs, which are optional. You don't actually need the destruction bombs for the actual destruction, but it can be helpful as a support to help you break the shapes, which we'll look at later. If you don't need it, you can bring something else to help your raid, like Swiftness Cape or Marching Flag. The build is the same. We're going to want to bring Soundholic and Rhapsody with Vital Point hit if possible, because there are quite a few stagger checks in Gate 3. I hope you're seeing a pattern here because this only continues throughout Gate 4, 5, and 6. Now the first mech happens at 145 bars, where you'll eat a meteor, do a typing test, and then stagger the boss. Try to have your stagger skills up before this mech happens, although the mech does last a little longer now after the nerfs. Generally you won't need to throw a whirlwind here, but you can if the stagger check looks tight. Next is the 100 bar stagger mech. It's just a simple stagger check except with eyes that spawn, and you either have to look at these eyes or look away from them while staggering, just like a Medusa. Again, you want to have your stagger skills up before 100 bars, and because of the Medusa mechanic, the stagger check can actually be a lot closer than you think, because some people might get knocked away after failing the Medusa mechanic. This is a good time to throw whirlwind grenades to cover for anyone who fails and gets knocked away. Now 45 bars is where the shape mech happens, and this is probably where you'll do the most amount of progging. As a bard, I'd recommend going to one of the diamond positions. That's going to be at 11, 1 o'clock, or 6 o'clock. Since a lot of your skills have a big AoE, they can cause problems if you're breaking the inner squares by accident. 11 and 1 o'clock are easier, whereas 6 is tougher, and that's just because of the order in which the shapes spawn. If you find yourself at the 6 o'clock spot, where the shapes spawn at the very last, you can use Whirlwind and Destruction Grenade to break the shapes quickly. For Bard, I'll usually position myself in the center of the 3 shapes I have to break, and I'll break the center shape with Prelude. I'll use Soundholic to break another shape without moving too much from the center, and then I'll use Sound Shock for the last shape. Using Sound Shock is a little bit riskier because it can low roll the damage and not break the shape, so you might have to follow up with another skill. The safest thing to do, and what I would recommend, is for the last shape, throw a grenade which will one-shot the shape. Paladins can use Holy Sword or Executors along with a grenade. You should try a few things and see what works for you. Once you find something you like and that's pretty consistent, then you can just do the same thing every time. Now let's talk about some of the dangerous patterns in this gate. During the Star and Pentagram attack, if anyone fails to get the Shield of Light buff, you normally eat 1 tick of the AoE and then use your time stop. As a support, if you can see that someone in your party doesn't get the buff, you can use your Awakening or DR like Rhapsody and Godsend to help them survive. Make sure you communicate with them so they don't waste their time stop if you're going to save them, but even if they do, it's better to be safe than sorry. This basically works the exact same way as someone that fails the Velganus pattern in Vicus Hard Gate 1. The timing on this one is pretty much instant, so as soon as you get your shield and you see that someone doesn't have it, just use your skills right away. For the maze mech, if you have slower allies or people that are struggling to react to the maze, you can use a marching flag here to help them if they haven't already brought their own swiftness gate. On to Gate 4. Items and builds are the same as Gate 3. Stagger is even more important here, so make sure you save your Whirlwind Bombs for the crucial stuff. If you're dropping heavy armor, I'd really recommend having the Tortoise plus We'll Meet Again card set available to compensate for the defense loss. Because although you might be good at dodging, there are times in Gate 4 where you may need to soak projectiles for your DPS. Again, the choice is up to you. The main thing in Gate 4 is to just be aware of your positioning as a support. The number one priority is to be standing in the correct place before the mech starts, and being aware of what color the boss is so that you know where to stand. Again, I won't cover the detailed mechanics here, so I recommend checking my Twitch lecture or any other guide if you want the detailed explanations. For the Buddy Stagger, aka when the cube is blue, make sure you have your main stagger skill available before the mech happens. That would be Soundholic for bards. If you don't, I would use a Whirlwind here just to ensure that you don't fail the stagger check and kill both yourself and your buddy. When everyone stacks up, you can pre-throw Fire Grenade on the ground, if you brought it, to break people out of the imprison while you're doing the typing test. As a bard, you kind of have Fire Grenade at home by pre-casting Prelude of Storm. The lightning AoE on the ground will continue to tick even while you're imprisoned, which will help you free people. The timing is generally about 10 seconds after the cubes first spawn, so instead of counting, what you can do is use a skill like Wind of Music or Heavenly Tune right when the mech starts as a timer, and then you can just prelude when the skill comes off cooldown. Of course, this isn't 100% precise, so experiment a bit to find the timing that works for you. Even if you don't get it off, it's not a huge deal, so no pressure. Paladins, of course, can precast any AoE skill they have, like Holy Land, if they have it. And then once you're free, any multi-hit skill will be really good at breaking people out of imprisonment. For the Relay Stagger, or when the cube is red, it really depends on whether or not you have Vital Point or not. If you don't have Vital, your stagger is honestly not that great, so try to take the first spot in the relay. That means that you want to stand near the head of the boss when the mech happens, and immediately you want to run into the safe spot to activate it. Then you can just AFK. If you do have Vital Point hit, you can stay out longer and do the stagger checks. However, if one of the shapes spawns nearby, you should just take it and run into the safe zone. Usually Whirlwind isn't needed for this, but if you feel like the last few stagger checks are tight or you don't have any skills up, feel free to throw one. After the nerfs, this mech really isn't that challenging anymore, but having Vital Point hit will just make it that much smoother. For the last white mechanic, the Yellow Stagger, you'll want to have a DPS break the black orb, and another person with low stagger eat the yellow orb that shoots out. If you have no Vital Point, again, you can be the one that eats the yellow orb, then you'll get the shield buff, at which point you should leave the yellow circle and eat up the purple projectiles. But if you do have Vital Point, you should be one of the two staggering, so stand off to the side, wait for the orb to be broken, somebody else will eat the yellow orb and spawn the yellow circle. You're going to want to walk in once it's clear and stagger the boss. I'd really recommend throwing Whirlwind for this as well, if you see that your stagger is late, or if there's a mistake eating the yellow orb. Remember that when you stand in the yellow circle, your stagger is increased by 5 times, so don't use your skills if you aren't in the circle. The second positioning thing that I talked about earlier is that there are times when you will want to body block or soak projectiles for your DPS. This especially is true during the yellow shape change patterns, where there are projectiles everywhere and meteors falling. If you see all your DPS standing in one place, try to move over to them instead of just staying where you are and shielding nobody. This fight can get really chaotic, so it helps if you maybe periodically ping yourself or call in Discord to stack up when possible. You can even set up a text macro for this to your party, and I'd recommend trying to use awakening skills during the yellow shape changes or when you see meteors because they can be extremely painful. Gate 5. Items and build here are going to be the exact same as Gate 4. Let's start with the main concept of Gate 5. Gate 5 and 6, these gates are honestly all about coordination and how well your raid can complete the group mechanics. So, as I mentioned before, I won't be going over too much here because I think there's a limit to what you can do as an individual. So rather than focusing on how you use your abilities to cheese a certain mechanic or attack, you should use all of your spare mental power, in my opinion, to help communicate and brief people on the mechanics that are coming up. Supports are one of the best raid callers because our skill usage is relatively easier compared to DPS, and we're very tanky with lots of defensive options. So honestly, if you want to make the most impact as a support in gates 5 and 6, focus on really learning the mechanics and helping your raid get through them with your communication. That being said, I will go over a few things you can do while trying Gate 5. As a support, it's very likely that you'll be party number 4, which means you'll be responsible for eating 8 shapes. It's better for a support to do this as it can be a huge DPS loss for your DPS players to run around and eat so many shapes. If there's one tip I have for you, it's that you have plenty of time to get your shapes. If you're in party 1, for example, and you have to eat white shapes, most of them will come to you because the white shapes fly across the map. One quote-unquote mistake that you can make is completely ignoring the boss and spending all your time running around eating 8 shapes before coming back. This is because shapes will continue spawning until you reach a certain amount of boss HP, and instead of just eating them when they inevitably fly at you, you'll be forced to dodge them because you've already eaten your 8 shapes and you can't eat anymore. Not only that, any DPS around you will have to also dodge because they probably have their shapes eaten as well. So if you're just a little bit more patient, you can keep hitting the boss, building meter, and using your skills, and then wait for the white shapes to come to you. This way, when they fly across the screen, instead of everyone having to dodge, you can just get rid of them and make everyone's lives easier. If you're in party 2, the black shapes don't actually move, they stay in place, so this doesn't really apply to party 2. However, you should still try and go and eat your shapes after using your skills, so you can just run around and eat shapes while your skills are on cooldown. This sounds really basic, but it can be a little hectic when you first try Gate 5, so just try to keep it in mind. Now during the actual shape mech, after the nerfs, you can fail up to 1 meteor during the entire pull. Instead of instantly wiping you, it will do big damage to the entire raid, which usually people deal with by using time stop. If you happen to have your skills up like Guardian Tune or Rhapsody and Godsend and so on, or Awakening, you can use that instead. The rest of it will just come down to how well your raid can coordinate. Again, gates 5 and 6 are really about teamwork and not really about skill usage or ways to cheese. Just try and use your abilities on cooldown as best as possible. For gate 6, I would drop Soundholic and bring Buckshot instead. Counter is really important for the 112 bar mechanic, and you can't really rely on anyone else to help you. Again, remember we are focusing on the main mechanics, so there's not much to talk about in terms of support specific gameplay. That being said, there are a few things that I like to do, and if you guys discover anything that you like to do in Gate 6, make sure to leave a comment down in the comments below. When the first twisters spawn at 230 bars, I like to use my Awakening here since they can do a lot of damage, especially if you're not super overgeared. I'll also hold my identity buff until after the first shapes mech, so that we can push DPS faster to the 188 bar mech. After the shapes, I'll use my DR abilities like Guardian and Rhapsody so that I can stand next to the boss and soak the damage while checking out the shape that we need to see. If you didn't know, if you're too far away from the boss, you won't be able to see the shape, so this is a really good time to use these abilities. The same goes for the 112 bar mech. The pizza explosion is relatively simple to dodge, but because of the camera being so zoomed out, some people accidentally step on it from time to time, and in that case it does a ton of damage, so it's nice to just use your DR abilities and shield in case someone gets hit. It's not like you're going to need them for the next mech anyway, so it's better than doing absolutely nothing with your cooldowns. There's also a variety of patterns that can do raid damage if not completed properly. This includes the blue Lynx AoE, where everyone has to stack up, or the red circle AoE where everyone has to stack up and then spread out and then stack up again in the red circle, but it's nice if you can use some kind of party-wide damage reduction whenever you see these patterns, or shield just in case somebody doesn't complete it properly. Lastly, about the yellow AoEs that BRELSHAZA does, these will knock you back really far and likely off the platform, which will kill you just like in Vulcan. If you find yourself inside the yellow AoE and you aren't sure if you can make it out with a spacebar, it's best to not get greedy and use one of your super armors like Rhapsody, Sonic Vibration, or even Time Stop. This is a really important concept. In Gate 6, if you ever feel a little unsure about a pattern that can knock you off, just don't hesitate and use a super armor or time stop immediately. If you're greedy with your spacebar or your items, you can die extremely easily, which will make the fight much harder for anyone alive. That about covers it for 1 to 6. I know there isn't much tip-wise compared to the other gates or even raids, but let me remind you, the main difficulty of these gates will be dealing with the mechanics. If you have the extra brain power, you can help your raid caller keep track of the meteors in Gate 6, for example, help do math for the timers, or help call out counters in Gate 4, or even just direct people where to go. The more you practice, the easier it gets, so stick with it. And if you have any questions, always feel free to come find me on Twitch or leave me a comment below. Good luck, and I'll see you all in the next one.